To give us another perspective of how December 7th, 1941 impacted her life is my friend Ann Bjorneby. Ann now lives between Everett and Snohomish, but in 1941, she was working on the line at an Iowa butter factory. Okay. I'm from Iowa, so of course that's why she's near and dear to my heart. But it was December 7th was the catalyst that resulted in Ann spending more than a decade with the United States Army and then the United States Navy. So, Ann?
Honestly, I won't take an hour. I just have some minutes. 93 years ago, I was born in North Chula Vista, Iowa, a small town north of Dubuque, Iowa. My father and mother had 11 children, and I was the middle child. My dad was a farmer and a postmaster, a fourth-class postmaster, which meant he got a salary from the letters and mail that went out. Well, for 2 cents, there was first a penny postcard, and then you could mail a letter for 1 1/2 cents. So his salary at the post office was virtually nil. We had no car, no electricity, no radio, and no telephone, and we were very poor. My mother did the shopping mostly from a big catalog, and we wore hand-me-down clothes and hand-me-down shoes. I wore hand-me-down shoes till I left when I was 16 years old. That was my first job at a lovely home in Dubuque, Iowa, and I was a maid nanny. Room and board and $5 a week was my salary. But I had Thursday afternoon off and Sunday afternoon. Now Dubuque had a limited bus service, so beyond that you were on your own unless you had a car. Well, of course I didn't have a car. So a childhood friend of mine worked down in Dubuque too. She and I decided we're going to get bicycles. So we went down to the bike store, and of course you know what our wages were. Mm-hmm. We bought a bicycle on time payment plan. And every Thursday afternoon you'd find us down at the bike shop making our payments till we got that bicycle paid for. And then I lived with these people, they were wonderful, and they got such a kick out of me because I had never been around electricity. And if I plugged in the electricity, I was afraid I was going to get executed. Anyway, one day, a Sunday, they were wonderful people, they were so upset, and I couldn't imagine what was wrong, and I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor." That changed all our lives forever. Everybody was devastated, and you heard remarks about there was going to be blackouts and bomb shelters, and all kinds of different things were going to happen. And Dubuque had nothing, no jobs or anything, and everything was low, so expensive, and you couldn't find it. It was scarce, and the government issued us a war ration books. I have 2 of them left. And you had to have a coupon to buy just about anything you wanted because there was hardly anything around Dubuque to have and no jobs. And I remember I went to the little store to buy some toothpaste, and they said, "Oh no, you have to bring in your smashed old tube in order to buy a new toothpaste." Well, anyway, I went home and found that old smashed tube and brought it in and bought myself some toothpaste. Then about that time, a friend of mine said, "You know, there's one job in Dubuque now. If you want it, why don't you go and try to find out what it is?" So I went in. I hated to leave these wonderful people, but I did get the job at Armour's for 40 cents an hour, wrapping butter. And as I wrapped butter, my butter wrappers around me, many of them had loved ones fighting in the war already. And my heart just ached for them. It was just terrible. And there wasn't much I could do about it. But then I also I couldn't live with these people anymore. I lived at the Catholic Young Women's
Dormitory?
boarding house. But 2 other girls and I decided we had to do something more for the war effort. So we took St. Louis, Missouri, Omaha, Nebraska, and Detroit, Michigan in a hat. And we pulled out, 2 of us pulled out Omaha, Nebraska. So we decided we're going to go to Omaha, Nebraska and work in the war effort. So I went to my boss at Armours and I said, Gil, I'm going to quit because I'm going to go to Omaha, Nebraska to work in the war effort. And he said, Ann, do you have a job there? And I said, no, but I have $15. So he said, don't quit, just take a leave of absence. You're such a good worker, I want you to come back. And I said, no, I have to quit, otherwise I might not do my best. So we 3 boarded the bus and went to Omaha. We rented a room for $2 a week, which was a bed and a room. Each day we went to the employment agency. No work. It was as bad as Dubuque. Into the second week, our money was starting to get a little lower. And that day the lady said, well, you know, you seem to really want to work so hard. There is one other thing you could do. You could join the WOWs. And we thought she said WAC. So we said, no, we don't want to be a WAC. And she said, well, you won't be a WAC, you'll be a WOW. And a WOW was a women ordnance worker. And she said you could go to the Women Ordnance Workers Civilian Automotive Technical School, and once you graduated from there, they would send you somewhere where the government needed you. Oh, good, so we joined that. When we got to Plattsmouth, Nebraska, we lived in barracks. We were under government rule. There was reveille in the morning, tap at evening, lights out at 9 o'clock. We had a march just like any other soldier. We had to police the area, pick up cigarette butts, and I didn't smoke, but you had to pick them up anyway. And we ate in a mess hall, no recreation, and that was our life there. And when lights were out at 9 o'clock, I'd go into the tree and sit in there, and we had to learn the name of every tool in our toolbox. And I studied that, and I studied any automotive literature that was available. When we graduated from there, Dorothy went to Camp Carson, Colorado to work at carburetors, and Marge and I were sent to Camp Hale, Colorado, which was the home of the 10th Mountain Division ski troops. We didn't live on the base. We lived across the railroad tracks in a little place called Pando, Colorado. There were many barracks there for the civilians, and a mess hall and a lab and a library. Well, one day in our mess hall, in our barracks, we discovered there were bed bugs. I was horrified. I thought I'll never be able to go back home because if I brought a bed bug back to Iowa, I'd never be forgiven. But the Army stepped in and gave us sleeping bags, and we slept on the floor in the library while they fumigated our barracks. And each day when we went to work, the Army had a bus that took us across the tracks to wherever we were working on the base. If you missed the bus, you had to walk. We had no cars or anything. And Marge, she was in the tool room and supply room, and I was in the grease rack. So I became the grease monkey. And when I wasn't busy in the grease rack, I would go over to the parts room and help Marge and them because the government had gotten these huge bales of rags, and with scissors we would have to cut them up to make grease racks for the mechanics. This auto repair shop was a huge building. The colonel had an office, and our superintendent had an office. The rest was latrines, and then the supply room, and the big booths of repair shops where they brought in the vehicles and worked on them. Once in a while, an armed guard would bring in some POWs from Italy, in other words, prisoners of war from Italy, came in to clean the floors there. And we worked there, and one day I was over there helping them cut up the rags, and in this group of rags was a beautiful long evening gown. Well, we had a young man there who was real neat. We said, why don't you put that beautiful evening gown on and try it on? So he put on that long evening gown. We said, now model it for us a little bit. So he did. Suddenly we saw the colonel coming. Oh, the colonel's coming. He took that scissors and he went right down to the floor, stepped right out of the evening gown. We were trying not to laugh by the time the colonel got. And then that was the end of that story. That was just one nice time. But one time at the grease trap, we greased, I think what they were called pups, a tiny little motorized vehicle that one person could ride at. And we greased and oiled, changed oils on Jeeps and trucks and cars, snowmobiles, and fire engines. And one day after we had finished greasing this fire engine, my boss said to me, Ann, why don't you take and drive the fire truck around to the front of the big building, the auto repair shop. So on the way over there, I'm driving the fire truck and I'm thinking, what would happen if I pressed the button a little bit? Well, what happened? It went, ooh, ooh, ooh. And I thought, oh my gosh, how can I stop it? Maybe I should press it more. So I pressed it more, and there was much more noise. By the time I got to the front of the building, here was the MPs, how many officers and cars. The colonel came out of his office. My boss came out of his office. There were fire truck there. What a commotion. When I stepped down off of that fire truck, my boss said to me, Ann, go to my office. Well, I knew that was the end of me. But I went to the office. And while I'm in there waiting for him to come, the phone rang, so I thought I better answer it. I was so nervous, I answered the phone, I dropped it, it fell on the floor and broke in about 10 pieces. Well, I knew, I don't think I slept that night because I knew the next day they would be rid of me. But they kept me anyway. And we stayed there until they closed the camp down. The 10th Mountain Division went on invasion of Aleutian Islands, and we went on to the Hill Air Force Base in Utah. As we left Camp Hale, the contractors were still building apartments and stuff at one end of Camp Hale, but the camp was closed. Anyway, we got to Utah, and we lived in barracks, and I was assigned a test block where you tested all the motors for the engines and stuff. Again, we lived in the barracks. We ate in a mess hall, and there was a library and no entertainment. But backtracking to Camp Hale, Colorado, they had a huge, tremendous recreation area, dance hall, USO entertainers, movie theater, bowling alley. They had everything there, and occasionally they would flood one field for ice skating. So there was plenty, and there were NCO clubs you could go to. There were a lot of things you could do in Camp Hale. At the dance floor there, I learned to jitterbug. And there's where I met my future husband. But we didn't get married till after the war. That was backtracking to Camp Hale. Well, in Utah, I would write to my boyfriend, and I thought, he was from Norway, and I thought, I want to learn some Norwegian words. So when he'd write to me, he'd write a Norwegian word in English. And then I decided I'm going to learn how to say the Lord's Prayer in Norwegian. So he was up in Alaska, and when he finally came back when the war was over, in the meantime, he had transferred to Army Transport Service, and he was then a chief warrant officer. I was still in my barracks in Utah, and he stayed at, I think it was the Ben Lomond Hotel in Salt Lake. Well, we didn't have a car, so we just walked. And one day we walked up the side of the mountain, and he sang to me a little song in Norwegian. Well, he sang Norwegian, en liten gilden ring, which means a little gold ring. And there was nobody in Utah that spoke Norwegian, so I had learned the Lord's Prayer in Pontius. I had nobody to explain how to say a word. Well, I could hardly wait to say it. I know the whole Lord's Prayer in Norwegian. So I proceeded to say it. And when I got through, you know what he said? That was nice, Ann, but only you and God know what you're saying. Anyway, I think I've gone on too long.
No, tell us how you got into the Navy then.
Oh.
Because you were with the women's...
That was before he came back, yeah. I thought the war would never end. So I wrote to the Army and I wrote to the Navy. And I heard from both of them and they wanted me to join them. Well, I took the test and I passed and I joined the Navy. And I was waiting to be sent somewhere, and then the war ended and I got this big letter with my discharge notice and all that kind of thing. That's how I got the Navy. So I actually wasn't on military duty. But even when I left Utah and went to Seattle, I went to Pure 91. So I worked there till we adopted our daughter. So all my 12 years or so, I had lived in barracks. I could tell you all about it, and that was just my life, and it was okay. I liked everything. I really did.
You probably lived in the barracks more in those 12 years than I did in my entire career.
I probably did. Yeah. I don't know. It seemed like I was going to tell you I don't want to bore anybody, but I wrote something here about something. The war was on. I should go back to Pearl Harbor. We were all so upset, and everybody didn't know what to do, and it was just chaotic, and there was no work in Dubuque, and things were poor, and then we had ration books, and they were talking about bomb shelters and all. Anyway, so then I'll go back to Utah. There was a shortage of men, and the people needed help in the food processing plants. So a bunch of us that worked at the airfield said we would work for them. So when we got off our work at the airfield, the bus came and picked us up, took us down to this food processing plant where we worked till about 9 o'clock at night, and they'd bring us back to the barracks, and we'd go to bed, and that's the way our routine was. Well, I was assigned to do the processing of selecting tomatoes as they came down this conveyor belt. That was my job at the food processing plant. They said, Ann, pick out all the leaves and all the rotten tomatoes. Well, this belt's going, You're picking out stuff, suddenly you get a rotten tomato, and you try twice to get the rotten tomato. In the meantime, how many tomatoes went past? I never ate ketchup for about 3 years. I guess that's about that. I got so many minutes here. But I think that's enough, don't you think?
Okay, Ann. Thank you.